Hello again. Here is a short video explaining about the charges on the two ions in an ionic compound. For example, let's say I have an ionic compound that's made of calcium and oxygen, so they form calcium oxide. And I want you all to understand the charges on both calcium and the oxide ion in calcium oxide. So let's start with calcium. Calcium, Ca, it belongs to group 2, so it's a metal. And looking at the proton number, it has 20 protons, which means it also has 20 electrons. So the electronic configuration of calcium would be 2 in the first shell, 8 electrons in the second shell, 8 in the third shell, and finally it has 2 electrons in the outermost shell. Or I can say there are 2 valence electrons in calcium, right? Let's do the same with oxygen. Oxygen belongs to group 6, so it has 8 electrons. Let's write the electronic configuration of oxygen as 2 and 6, which means there are 6 valence electrons in oxygen. Now, we have learned in class that metals tend to lose electrons. Metals lose electrons. Non-metals gain electrons. That's one thing that you need to keep in mind. So calcium being a metal, to get a full outer shell, to become stable, to get a full outer shell of 8 electrons, it has to lose 2 electrons. So it will lose 2 of its valence electrons to oxygen. So let's see what happens when calcium loses 2 of its valence electrons to oxygen. Originally, calcium had 20 protons and 20 electrons. So protons are positive, electrons have negative charge, so the total charge would be positive 20 minus 20, that's 0. So before losing electrons on a calcium atom, the total charge was 0. And now let's see what happens, or what is the charge on calcium after it lost 2 electrons. So let's write here, let's say now calcium has 20 protons, proton number doesn't change. So how many electrons are remaining after calcium loses 2 of its valence electrons to oxygen? So proton number doesn't change, so this is after losing. Now since calcium lost 2 valence electrons, now it's left with 18 electrons. That means there are 18 negative charges. So the net charge on calcium would be positive 20 minus 18, that's positive 2. It's very critical that you show the positive charge on the ions, right? So that would be positive 2. So in other words, calcium, when it loses its 2 valence electrons, it will get a charge of Ca2+. And this is the convention. You write the number first, 2, and then the positive sign. And what does this mean? Let's take a look at this math here. So after calcium lost 2 of its valence electron, if you compare the number of positive charges and negative charges, there are 20 protons and 18 electrons, which means there are 2 protons more in calcium now. That's what the 2+ sign means. When calcium loses 2 of its valence electrons, there are 2 protons more in number. If you compare these two, there are 2 protons more in number as compared to the number of electrons. Let's do the same with oxygen. Now originally on an oxygen atom there are 8 protons, which means 8 positive charges, and 8 electrons, which means the total charge on oxygen atom is 0, right? That's on a neutral atom. Now what happens, what is the charge on oxygen or oxide ion after it gained 2 electrons? So the proton number doesn't change, so this is after gaining. So proton number remains the same, or 8 protons or 8 positive charges. Since it's gaining 2 electrons from calcium, now the total number of electrons would be 8 plus 2 electrons, which is 10 electrons. So since oxygen gained 2 from calcium, the electron number became 10. So that's positive 8, negative 10, which would be negative 2. Now I can say the charge on an oxide ion would be O2 minus. So we write the number 2 first and then the negative charge. Now again, what does this charge 2 minus mean? If you look at these numbers of subatomic particles, there are 8 protons, 10 electrons on oxide ion, which means there are 2 electrons more. Can we say that? 2 electrons more on oxide ion. That's why it has 2 minus charge. As a result, now calcium and oxygen come together to form an ionic compound like this: Ca2 plus, O2 minus. So the charges are equal, so we don't have to do any multiplication here. So the resulting formula, chemical formula for ionic compound calcium oxide would be CaO. There is no manipulation or mathematical operations needed here because the positive and negative charges are equal. So re-watch this video. I want you all to understand how atoms become ions, what the charges mean, and the process of formation of ionic compounds. So that's the end of this video.